May 14, 1943. Bay of Biscay. The commander of U-456 stands in the conning tower, scanning the horizon through his binoculars. His diesel engines rumble beneath him, recharging the batteries that keep his submarine alive. He's confident. Why wouldn't he be? For 2 years, German U-boats have owned these waters. They've sent millions of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the Atlantic. And when aircraft appear, the solution is simple. Dive, and you're safe. Then the lookout shouts. Aircraft. Bearing 270. A Catalina patrol bomber, probably American, maybe British. The commander doesn't panic. He's done this dance 100 times. He gives the order calmly, almost casually. Dive. 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 The klaxon sounds. Men scramble below. The vents open. Water floods the ballast tanks. U-456 slips beneath the waves like a ghost disappearing into fog. 60 meters down, the commander allows himself a slight smile. Another escape. Another day hunting Allied convoys. The aircraft crew above will drop their depth charges in frustration, guessing blindly where his boat might be. They'll miss by hundreds of meters. They always do. The statistics prove it. More than 85% of U-boats survive aircraft attacks. Diving is practically a guarantee of safety. Then he hears it. A sound that shouldn't exist. A motor. Getting louder. Getting closer. Not fading away like depth charges falling through water. No. This sound is tracking them. Following them. Hunting them. The crew freezes. Eyes wide. What is that? The commander has no answer. He's never heard anything like it. The sound grows louder still, a mechanical whine that seems to know exactly where they are, that adjusts its course as they adjust theirs. The explosion tears through U-456's pressure hull like paper. The Atlantic Ocean rushes in with the force of 1,000 hammers. Men scream. Metal shrieks. In seconds, it's over. U-456 and her entire crew plunge toward the ocean floor, 3,000 meters down where they'll rest forever. The Catalina crew above sees oil and debris bubble to the surface. They mark it as a kill, but they don't fully understand what they've just done. They don't know they've just fired the first shot in a revolution that will change submarine warfare forever. They don't know they've just unleashed the weapon that will terrify every German U-boat captain in the Atlantic. A weapon so secret that even they don't know what it really is. A weapon their own Navy almost banned as impossible. A weapon disguised as something it's not. Hidden behind a lie so effective that the enemy will never figure it out. A weapon that hunts like a bloodhound, listening for its prey in the darkness of the deep ocean, following relentlessly until it finds its target. This is the story of the Mark 24, but that's not what it really was. That name was a deception, a cover story. A lie told so well that it fooled everyone, including the men who dropped it from their aircraft. They thought they were dropping mines. Special mines. Advanced mines. But mines nonetheless. They had no idea they were carrying the most revolutionary torpedo ever created. They had no idea they were carrying the weapon that would turn the Battle of the Atlantic on its head and send the German U-boat fleet into a spiral of terror and confusion from which it would never recover. To understand why this weapon was so revolutionary, you need to understand just how desperate the situation was in 1942. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just another campaign. It was the campaign. Winston Churchill, who faced down Hitler without flinching, who rallied Britain through the Blitz, who never showed fear in public, later admitted that only one thing truly frightened him during the entire war: the U-boat peril. Because if Germany won the Battle of the Atlantic, Britain would starve. America's industrial might would be useless, trapped on the wrong side of an ocean controlled by wolf packs of German submarines. The war would be lost. And in 1942, Germany was winning. U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than shipyards could replace them. Much faster. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Every month the Allies needed to maintain a certain tonnage of shipping to keep Britain supplied. Every month U-boats sent more tonnage to the bottom than that threshold. Britain's reserves were draining. Her fuel stocks were dropping. Her food supplies were dwindling. The noose was tightening. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, could see victory. A few more months of this rate of sinking and Britain would have to negotiate. Germany would win without ever invading England. The Allies threw everything they had at the problem. More escort ships, better convoy tactics, improved radar, Long-range patrol aircraft. And that last innovation, the long-range patrol aircraft, seemed like it should be the answer. Because U-boats had a fatal weakness. They weren't really submarines. Not in the modern sense. They were submersibles. They could dive, yes, but they couldn't stay down for long. Their electric motors running on batteries gave them only a few hours of underwater operation at slow speed. To cross the Atlantic, to chase convoys, to position themselves for attacks, they needed their diesel engines. And diesel engines need air, which meant U-boats spent most of their time on the surface, which meant they were vulnerable to aircraft. And by 1942, the Allies had aircraft that could patrol far out into the Atlantic, covering areas that had previously been beyond the range of air cover. These aircraft had radar that could spot a surfaced U-boat from miles away. They had the speed to reach the U-boat before it could dive. They had weapons, depth charges, and bombs that could destroy a submarine. On paper, this should have been the solution. Aircraft should have been slaughtering U-boats by the dozens. But they weren't. The kill rate was abysmal, embarrassingly low, frustratingly inadequate. For every 10 U-boats spotted by aircraft, fewer than 2 were sunk. More than 85% escaped. Some estimates put the survival rate even higher. U-boat commanders quickly learned the simple procedure that almost guaranteed survival. When you see an aircraft, dive immediately. Don't wait. Don't try to fight. Just dive. By the time the aircraft reaches your position, you'll be deep enough that their weapons can't touch you. Because depth charges and bombs had a fundamental problem. They had to explode very close to the submarine's hull to cause fatal damage. Within a few meters, ideally. The shock wave from the explosion needed to crack the pressure hull or damage critical systems. A near miss wasn't good enough. And hitting a target you can't see, that's moving underwater, that could be anywhere within a large area, was nearly impossible. The aircraft crew had to guess. They had to estimate where the U-boat would be by the time their weapons sank to the right depth. They had to factor in the U-boat's speed, its direction, the time delay, the ocean currents. It was guesswork. Educated guesswork, but still guesswork. And guesswork doesn't win wars. The U-boat commanders knew this. They understood the statistics. They grew confident, cocky even. They surfaced in daylight to recharge their batteries, something that would have been suicidal earlier in the war. They knew that if they spotted an aircraft in time to dive, they were almost certainly safe. Aircraft became a nuisance, not a threat. An inconvenience that interrupted their battery charging, not a weapon that could kill them. Some U-boat commanders even reported feeling annoyed rather than frightened when aircraft appeared. The Battle of the Atlantic was becoming a shooting gallery, and the U-boats were the shooters, not the targets. The Allies needed a breakthrough. They needed a weapon that could kill a submerged U-boat. A weapon that didn't require guesswork. A weapon that could track a diving submarine and follow it down into the depths. A weapon that could hunt. But how do you build such a weapon? How do you track something you can't see, moving through a medium where visibility is measured in meters, not miles? How do you guide a weapon underwater when radio signals don't penetrate seawater? How do you create a weapon that can think for itself, that can hunt autonomously without human guidance? In 1942, most Navy admirals would have told you it was impossible. Science fiction. The stuff of Jules Verne novels, not practical weapons. Torpedoes were dumb weapons. You aimed them, you fired them. They ran straight until they hit something or ran out of fuel. The idea of a torpedo that could steer itself, that could listen for its target and adjust its course, that could hunt like a predator stalking prey was too complex, too advanced, too unreliable. It would never work in combat conditions. It was a waste of time and resources to even try. But there was a group of engineers who disagreed. And they weren't even weapons designers. They were telephone engineers, scientists and technicians from Bell Telephone Laboratories, the research arm of AT&T, the company that connected America's phone calls. What did telephone engineers know about torpedoes? What did they know about submarine warfare? On the surface, nothing. But they knew something more important. They knew acoustics. They knew sound. They understood how to detect sound, how to filter sound, how to discriminate between different types of sound. They'd spent years developing technology to make telephone calls clearer, to reduce noise, to pick out a human voice from background static. And they realized something that the weapons experts had missed. A submarine makes noise, lots of noise. Its propellers churn through the water, creating a distinctive acoustic signature. Its electric motors hum. Its hull creaks under pressure. Even when it's trying to be quiet, a submarine is a symphony of sound underwater. And sound travels beautifully through water. Much better than through air. A submarine trying to hide in the ocean is like a person trying to hide in a quiet library while playing a trumpet. If you have the right ears, you can hear it from miles away. The Bell Labs engineers proposed something radical. A torpedo with ears. An acoustic homing torpedo. A weapon that would be dropped from an aircraft ahead of a diving U-boat. It would enter the water, activate its acoustic sensors, and listen. It would filter out the ambient noise of the ocean, the sound of waves, the clicks and whistles of marine life, the distant rumble of surface ships, and it would lock onto the specific frequency signature of a submarine's propellers. Then it would hunt. It would steer itself toward that sound, adjusting its course automatically as the submarine maneuvered. It would follow the U-boat down into the depths, getting closer and closer, until its warhead made contact and detonated. A fire-and-forget weapon. A weapon that required no guidance after launch. A weapon that could hunt autonomously. The Navy's response was predictable. Impossible. Too complex. Unproven technology. We need weapons that work now, not experimental projects that might work someday. We have depth charges. They're simple. They're reliable. They're proven. Yes, the kill rate is low, but that's a tactics problem, not a weapons problem. Train the aircrews better. Develop better attack patterns. But don't waste our time and money on science fiction weapons that will never work in combat. The project was nearly canceled. Multiple times. Budget reviews questioned whether it was worth continuing. Senior officers argued that resources should be focused on proven weapons, not experimental ones. The Bell Labs engineers were told politely but firmly that their idea was interesting but impractical. Thank you for your time. We'll call you if we need you. Don't call us. The acoustic homing torpedo seemed destined to die in a filing cabinet, a footnote in the history of rejected weapons concepts. But the situation in the Atlantic kept getting worse. The tonnage numbers kept climbing. The U-boat kill rate kept staying stubbornly low. And a few people in the Navy, people who were desperate enough to try anything, decided to give the Bell Labs engineers one more chance. Prove it works. Build a prototype. Test it. If it works, we'll consider production. If it doesn't, the project dies for good. The engineers had their reprieve, but they also had a deadline, and they had the weight of the entire Battle of the Atlantic on their shoulders. The development program began in earnest in late 1942, but it began under a cloud of secrecy that went far beyond normal military classification. Because the Navy had realized something important. If the Germans found out the Allies were developing an acoustic homing torpedo, they could develop countermeasures. They could modify their submarines to run more quietly. They could develop acoustic decoys. They could train their crews in evasion tactics. The element of surprise would be lost. And surprise, the Navy understood, would be half the weapon's effectiveness. A U-boat commander who knew an acoustic torpedo was hunting him might be able to evade it. A U-boat commander who had no idea what was happening would be helpless. So the weapon was given a cover designation. Not a torpedo. A mine. The Mark 24 mine. The name was chosen carefully. Mines were defensive weapons, dropped in harbors and shipping channels to protect against enemy vessels. They were boring, unglamorous. Not the kind of weapon that would attract attention from spies or intelligence analysts. If a German agent heard that the Americans were developing a new mine, he'd file a report and move on to more interesting targets. He wouldn't realize he'd just learned about the most revolutionary anti-submarine weapon of the war. The deception went deeper. Production facilities were told they were building mine components. Workers assembled parts without knowing what the final product was. Documentation referred to it only as the Mark 24 mine. Even the air crews who would eventually drop it in combat were told they were carrying special mines. Advanced mines. Mines with sophisticated fusing mechanisms. But mines, not torpedoes. Definitely not acoustic homing torpedoes. The truth was restricted to a tiny circle of people with the highest security clearances. Everyone else got the cover story. The Bell Labs engineers worked frantically through the winter of 1942 and into the spring of 1943. The technical challenges were immense. The acoustic sensors had to be sensitive enough to detect a submarine's propellers from a distance, but not so sensitive that they'd lock onto every random noise in the ocean. They had to distinguish between the specific frequency signature of a submarine and the thousands of other sounds in the sea. They had to work reliably in salt water, under pressure in cold temperatures. They had to be rugged enough to survive being dropped from an aircraft into the ocean. The guidance system had to translate acoustic information into steering commands. It had to calculate the direction of the sound source and adjust the torpedo's course to intercept it. It had to do this continuously, updating its calculations as the submarine maneuvered. And it had to do all of this with 1940s technology. No computers, no digital processors, just mechanical systems, electrical circuits, and vacuum tubes. The engineers were essentially building an autonomous hunting robot with technology that was only slightly more advanced than a 1930s radio. The propulsion system had to be quiet. Ironic given that the weapon hunted by sound. But if the torpedo's own motor was too loud, it would drown out the acoustic sensors. The engineers couldn't use a conventional torpedo motor. They developed a special electric propulsion system that ran quietly enough not to interfere with the acoustic detection. It wasn't fast. The Mark 24 would cruise at only about 12 knots, slower than many submarines. But it didn't need to be fast. It just needed to be persistent. A bloodhound doesn't need to be faster than a rabbit. It just needs to follow the scent until the rabbit gets tired. The warhead was relatively straightforward. 92 pounds of Torpex, an explosive compound more powerful than TNT, enough to crack a submarine's pressure hull wide open. The fusing mechanism was designed to detonate on contact with a large metal object. Simple, reliable, deadly. If the Mark 24 found its target, the target would die. The only question was whether it could find its target. Testing began in early 1943 at secret Navy facilities. Allied submarines volunteered to play the role of targets, running evasion patterns while Mark 24 prototypes hunted them. The early tests were failures. The acoustic sensors locked onto the wrong targets. The guidance system sent the torpedoes in circles. The propulsion system was too loud. The engineers went back to their drawing boards, made adjustments, and tried again, and again, and again. Slowly, painfully, the weapon improved. The acoustic discrimination got better. The guidance system got more reliable. The propulsion system got quieter. By April 1943, the Mark 24 was working. Not perfectly, not every time, but well enough. In controlled tests, it was finding and tracking its target more often than not. The Navy gave approval for combat deployment. Production ramped up. Air crews received training, though they still didn't know what they were really carrying. They were taught the attack procedure. Spot a U-boat. Wait for it to dive. Drop the Mark 24. Mine ahead of the submarine's projected position, then leave the area. Don't stick around to watch. Don't try to assess the results. Just drop and go. The weapon would do the rest, or it wouldn't. Either way, the aircrew's job was done. The first combat deployment came in May 1943. Catalina patrol bombers operating over the Bay of Biscay, the stretch of water between France and Spain, where U-boats transited to and from their bases on the French coast. It was a hunting ground. U-boats had to cross it to reach the Atlantic. Allied aircraft patrolled it constantly. It was the perfect testing ground for the new weapon. And on May 14, 1943, a Catalina crew spotted U-456 on the surface. The U-boat dove immediately, following standard procedure. The Catalina crew followed their new procedure. They dropped a Mark 24 mine ahead of the diving submarine. Then they flew away. Minutes later, oil and debris surfaced. U-456 was gone. The first kill. The first proof that the weapon worked in combat, not just in controlled tests. But the Catalina crew didn't know exactly what had happened. They'd dropped a mine, and the U-boat had apparently hit it. Lucky placement. Good guess. They filed their report and moved on to the next patrol. They had no idea they'd just made history. They had no idea they'd just fired the opening shot in a campaign that would terrorize the German U-boat fleet and change the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. More kills followed in the weeks after U-456. U-boats kept diving to escape aircraft, and Mark 24s kept hunting them down. The German Naval Command began noticing a disturbing pattern. U-boats were disappearing after aircraft contacts. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But more than before. Significantly more. The survival rate was dropping. Slowly at first, then faster. By June 1943, U-boat commanders were reporting something new in their radio messages back to headquarters. The Allies have a new weapon. We don't know what it is, But aircraft attacks are much more dangerous than before. Diving doesn't guarantee safety anymore. The German intelligence services went into overdrive trying to figure out what had changed. They interrogated captured Allied air crews. They analyzed wreckage from shot-down patrol bombers. They studied intercepted radio communications. They found references to Mark 24 mines. Mines. That made sense. The Allies must have developed a new type of mine, something more sophisticated than the old contact mines. Maybe acoustic mines that detonated when they heard a submarine passing nearby. That would explain the increased danger. German Naval Command issued warnings to U-boat crews. Be careful in areas where the Allies might have laid new minefields. Avoid shallow waters. Stay deep when possible. But the warnings didn't help, because the Germans had completely misunderstood what they were facing. They weren't facing mines. They were facing hunters. Weapons that didn't wait passively for a submarine to come to them. Weapons that actively pursued their targets. Weapons that could be dropped anywhere, anytime by any patrol aircraft. There were no minefields to avoid. There was no safe depth. There was only the constant, terrifying possibility that when you dove to escape an aircraft, something would follow you down. Something that could hear you. Something that would hunt you relentlessly until it caught you. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was devastating. Imagine being a submariner. Your boat is your protection. When you're on the surface, you're vulnerable to aircraft and surface ships. But when you dive, you're safe. The ocean hides you, protects you. The enemy can't see you, can't hear you, can't touch you. That's the fundamental bargain of submarine warfare. You give up speed and comfort for invisibility and safety. Diving is your escape hatch, your panic button, your guarantee of survival. Now imagine that guarantee is gone. Now diving might save you, or it might doom you. You don't know which. You can't tell. You dive away from an aircraft and maybe you're safe. Or maybe something is following you down right now. Maybe it's listening to your propellers. Maybe it's getting closer. Maybe in 30 seconds your hull will rupture and the ocean will crush you like an insect. You don't know. You can't know. You can only wait and hope and pray that the explosion doesn't come. That's what the Mark 24 did to U-boat crews. It took away their certainty. It turned their refuge into a potential death trap. It made every dive a gamble. And humans are very bad at dealing with that kind of uncertainty. It's one thing to face a known danger. You can prepare for that. You can train for that. You can accept the risk and do your job. It's another thing entirely to face an unknown danger that might or might not be there, that might or might not kill you, that you can't see or fight or evade with any confidence. That kind of uncertainty eats at your mind. It makes you hesitant. It makes you second guess. It makes you afraid. U-boat morale began to crack. Crews that had been confident and aggressive became cautious and defensive. Commanders who had surfaced boldly in daylight now stayed submerged as much as possible, even though it meant slower transit times and reduced operational effectiveness. The wolf packs that had terrorized Allied convoys became less coordinated, less aggressive, less effective, because the wolves had learned that they were being hunted by something they couldn't understand. Something that turned the ocean itself into a trap. The statistics told the story in cold, brutal numbers. Before the Mark 24 deployment, U-boats had an 85% or higher survival rate against aircraft attacks. By the summer of 1943, that rate had plummeted to under 30%. The change was staggering, revolutionary. Aircraft had gone from being a minor nuisance to being the most dangerous threat a U-boat could face. And the U-boats couldn't adapt because they didn't understand what had changed. They knew something was different. They knew they were dying more often, but they didn't know why. They didn't know how. They didn't know what to do about it. German naval intelligence kept trying to solve the puzzle. They collected every scrap of information they could find. They analyzed the patterns of U-boat losses. They noted that losses were highest in areas with heavy air patrol activity. They noted that losses often occurred shortly after a U-boat dove to escape an aircraft. They theorized about new types of mines, new types of depth charges, new detection methods, but they never figured it out. They never realized they were facing acoustic homing torpedoes. The deception held. The Mark 24 mine designation worked perfectly. The Germans kept looking for mines and they never found the truth. Part of the reason the secret held was that Mark 24s rarely left evidence. When a torpedo hits a submarine, The submarine usually sinks intact or breaks into large pieces that might be recovered and analyzed. But when a Mark 24 hit a U-boat, it typically did so at depth, in deep water. The destroyed submarine would plunge to the ocean floor, often in water thousands of meters deep, far beyond the reach of any salvage operation. No wreckage to analyze, no weapon fragments to study, just oil slicks and debris floating to the surface and another U-boat that failed to return to base. The Mark 24 killed and left no witnesses, no evidence, no clues. The Allies maintained strict operational security throughout the weapon's deployment. Air crews were reminded constantly that they were carrying mines, not torpedoes. They were forbidden from discussing the weapons with anyone outside their unit. They were told that loose talk could cost lives, could give the enemy information that would help them develop countermeasures. And it worked. The secret held. Even within the Allied military, most people didn't know what the Mark 24 really was. The cover story was so effective that it fooled friendly forces as thoroughly as it fooled the enemy. By the end of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively in favor of the Allies. U-boat losses were mounting faster than Germany could replace them. Allied shipping losses were dropping. The tonnage war that Germany had been winning was now a losing battle. Admiral Dönitz, who had been so confident a year earlier, was now fighting a defensive campaign, trying to preserve his remaining U-boats rather than aggressively hunting convoys. The wolf packs were broken. The threat to Britain's supply lines was contained. The noose that had been tightening around Britain's neck was cut. The Mark 24 wasn't the only factor in this reversal. Better convoy tactics, more escort ships, improved radar, breaking the German naval codes, all of these contributed. But the Mark 24 was a crucial piece of the puzzle. It transformed aircraft from a minor threat into a major killer. It forced U-boats to stay submerged longer, reducing their operational effectiveness. It shattered the morale of U-boat crews. It created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that made German submarine operations far less effective. One weapon, deployed in secret, maintained through deception, had helped turn the tide of the most important campaign of the war. The final statistics are remarkable. During the war, Allied aircraft dropped 204 Mark 24 torpedoes in combat. Of those, 37 resulted in confirmed U-boat kills. That's an 18% success rate. Which might not sound impressive until you remember that the previous success rate for aircraft attacks on U-boats was in the low single digits. The Mark 24 increased the kill rate by a factor of 5 or more. And those 37 confirmed kills don't count the U-boats that were damaged but managed to limp back to base, or the U-boats that were forced to abort their patrols, or the operational disruption caused by U-boat crews being afraid to surface. The Mark 24's impact went far beyond its direct kill count. The weapon also had a broader impact on naval warfare. It proved that acoustic homing was practical. It demonstrated that autonomous weapons that could hunt without human guidance, were not science fiction but achievable reality. It established the template for modern anti-submarine torpedoes, which still use acoustic homing as their primary guidance method. Every modern navy in the world uses descendants of the Mark 24. The technology that Navy admirals dismissed as impossible in 1942 became the standard by which all anti-submarine weapons are measured. There's a deep irony in the Mark 24 story. The weapon that changed submarine warfare forever was almost canceled before it was built. It was rejected by the experts as too complex, too experimental, too unreliable. It was developed by people who weren't weapons designers, who came from outside the military-industrial complex, who applied civilian technology to a military problem. It was disguised so effectively that even the people who used it didn't know what it was. And it worked. It worked spectacularly. It worked so well that it terrified an entire branch of the German military and helped win the most crucial campaign of the Atlantic War. The story raises uncomfortable questions about innovation and institutional resistance. How many other revolutionary ideas have been rejected because they seemed too radical? How many problems have gone unsolved because the experts were too invested in conventional solutions? How many wars have been prolonged because military establishments resisted change? The Mark 24 succeeded despite institutional resistance, not because of institutional support. It succeeded because a few desperate people were willing to try something unconventional. It succeeded because the situation was dire enough that even crazy ideas got a chance. After the war ended, the truth about the Mark 24 was finally revealed. German naval officers who had survived the war learned what had been hunting their U-boats. Their reactions were a mixture of shock, respect, and relief. Shock that the Allies had developed such an advanced weapon. Respect for the engineering achievement and the operational security that had kept it secret. Relief that they finally understood what had been killing them. For years, they'd been fighting an invisible enemy, dying without knowing why. Now, at least, they had answers. Cold comfort for the thousands of submariners who had died without ever understanding what hit them. The Bell Telephone Laboratories engineers who developed the Mark 24 received recognition after the war, though their achievement remained classified for years. They'd taken a radical idea, turned it into a practical weapon, and helped change the course of history. They'd proved that innovation could come from unexpected places. They'd demonstrated that civilian expertise could solve military problems that military experts couldn't crack. They'd shown that sometimes the best weapon isn't the one that's most powerful or most sophisticated, but the one that solves the right problem at the right time. The Mark 24 Fido, as it was eventually nicknamed, the acoustic homing torpedo that was disguised as a mine, that was rejected as impossible, that was developed by telephone engineers, that terrified German U-boat captains, that changed submarine warfare forever, stands as one of the most successful weapons programs of World War II, not because it sank the most ships or killed the most enemies, but because it solved a critical problem that conventional weapons couldn't solve. It turned the tide of a campaign that was being lost. It broke the back of the U-boat threat. It helped ensure that Britain stayed in the war and that American supplies reached Europe. And it did all of this while remaining almost completely secret. The Germans never figured out what was killing them. Most Allied personnel never knew what the Mark 24 really was. Even today, the weapon is less famous than it deserves to be. It doesn't have the dramatic reputation of the atomic bomb, or the iconic status of the Spitfire, or the cultural presence of the Sherman tank. It's a footnote in most World War II histories. A technical curiosity. A specialized weapon for a specialized problem. But the people who understand submarine warfare know better. They know that the Mark 24 was revolutionary. They know it changed everything. They know that modern anti-submarine warfare is built on the foundation that the Mark 24 established. They know that the acoustic homing torpedo, the weapon that hunts by sound, the weapon that follows its prey relentlessly into the depths, is one of the most important weapons innovations of the 20th century. The next time someone tells you an idea is impossible, remember the Mark 24. Remember the telephone engineers who built a weapon that Navy admirals said couldn't be built. Remember the mine that wasn't really a mine. Remember the torpedo that hunted like a bloodhound. Remember the weapon that terrified every German U-boat captain in the Atlantic. Remember that sometimes the most impossible ideas are exactly the ones that change the world. Remember that innovation often comes from the most unexpected places. Remember that the best solutions sometimes come from people who don't know enough to understand why something can't be done, so they go ahead and do it anyway. The Mark 24 Fido. The banned torpedo that wasn't really banned. The impossible weapon that became reality. The secret that stayed secret. The hunter that changed the Battle of the Atlantic. The bloodhound that tracked U-boats to their doom. One of the most important weapons you've probably never heard of. One of the greatest deceptions of World War II. One of the most revolutionary innovations in naval warfare. And a reminder that sometimes, just sometimes, the crazy ideas are the ones that win wars. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more incredible untold stories from history. Hit that like button if you enjoyed learning about the weapon that changed submarine warfare forever, and drop a comment below telling us, what other secret weapons from World War II should we cover next? Your support helps us bring these hidden chapters of history to light. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.